He hasn't texted back and I'm freaking out. This is what we're talking about today. By the way, do you like my new house? It's not my house, but it is where I'm staying for the next week, 10 days. I'm not sure how long I'm here for actually, I'll have to check. This in the background is a beautiful Norwegian forest cat called Santa. Hi! She's gorgeous, I don't know if you can see her from there. She's the softest thing ever. She's really sweet. Anyway, okay, so we're going to talk about this whole phenomenon. And, you know, it's interesting because as I decided that this was the topic today, I was thinking back to when this was a reality for me, and like all I could find on the subject was, because like we Google it, don't we? We go on the YouTube machine and we're like, what fresh hell is this? What's going on? Why hasn't he texted back? And we get all the reasons why he hasn't texted back and all the things we should and shouldn't say to him. And so we start implementing this, and then he still doesn't text back, or he texts and we're like, what does this mean? And we go to our friends and it's just a clusterfuck of communication issues. And really, you know, here's the thing. I want to be respectful of my colleagues who work in dating strategy, who say that, you know, you've got to say these perfect lines, and there is a place for that. There is a place for understanding how to best communicate our needs, and that's a great thing. But here's what I want you to understand. If you don't feel like you get to have a really beautiful relationship, and if you have unhealed stuff in the background, it almost kind of doesn't matter what perfect line you say to him or her, because it's not going to stick. Nothing's going to stick when we have this wound that's active. Because I remember for me, I read all the dating books, listened to all the dating experts who were all really on point, and I'm like, okay, what I'm doing wrong, air quotes wrong, what I'm doing wrong is I'm texting back too soon, so I'll lean back. And it becomes this like thing where we start performing and pretending, and it's just, but we're still freaking out. So it's like, it's not helping. So I wanted to try and give you some information today about what we can do instead, because more than likely you've gone on the YouTube machine, you've watched the videos of why he hasn't texted back, but nothing's really changed and it's still bringing up this reaction in you. So what I get really curious about as a coach, as someone who's interested in psychology and our minds and why we do what we do, and from the relationship perspective, what I get really curious about is, what is this triggering in you? Why is it, and this is not a rhetorical question, why is it that when this person doesn't text you back, it provokes this reaction of, oh my God, like this anxiety, this feeling of just being out of control? And why is it that it takes you out emotionally? Let's look at that, and let's look at where that comes from. So what I'll do is I'll give you some possibilities of what this is, and I'm going to try and just adjust this. Hello, you just see the top of my head, but that's all right, so I can be a bit more comfy. That's better. Oh, this is really comfy. I could stay here all day and talk to you guys. Okay, so here's what's going on. You might think, well, I'm a pretty strong woman, I've got my shit together, I'm living a pretty good life. Why is it that this is provoking this reaction in me? Well, what it is it's a fear response, right? It's coming from fear. And it's fear of being abandoned and fear of not getting our needs met. And you might be thinking, well, I don't feel like that's me, because I'm a strong woman and I run a business, and you know, I'm pretty together. I don't feel like I need someone else. So that doesn't make sense to me. But here's the thing. It's not about you, the adult, the woman. It's about the little girl that's here, that's frightened, who is asking you to assure her and make her feel safe. It's her that's reacting. It's her that's afraid. And I know this might sound a bit woo and a bit out there, but it's really not. Like, our inner child is part of us. It's that part of us that's small and scared. It's that part that feels victimized, the part that feels really vulnerable and doesn't feel like she has a lot of power. That's the part of us that we need to speak to. So there's a number of ways that we can do that. And I have like inner child meditations out there that you can certainly do. I think there's some on the YouTube machine actually, and if there isn't, I'll make one at some point. And actually, if you go to some of my other videos, I'm sure there's one there. So that's what it is. It's like our inner child, she is really afraid, and she is being reminded of a time when she was left, when she was abandoned. And this could be as extreme as neglect, being neglected as a child. Neglect and abuse are pretty intense things to go through, and obviously there's a lot of impact that has on us and how we respond to people. But it doesn't necessarily have to be something that was really extreme. It can be that you were neglected emotionally because your caregivers and or parents didn't really have the skills to deal with you. When I say deal with you, like they didn't have the language. They didn't know how to communicate what was going on for them, and they didn't know how to manage their emotions. I was listening to an episode of Russell Brand's podcast. I've never listened to it before. I don't know why, because I adore him. I think he's wise. I think he's basically like this Jesus-like figure that spews wisdom. It's amazing. Anyway, he was talking to Brené Brown, and she was giving some of the the phrases that she says to her kids when they're having a moment and having a meltdown. And she said, the reason I can do this and the reason why it's so important to me is because I grew up in a really chaotic home. And so it's important for me to make sure that I'm communicating with my kids in this way. And she went into the whole thing. And it was, you know, what she said was so wise. And she's like, it's so hard sometimes. Sometimes I need a timeout. Sometimes mum needs a timeout. And this is someone that does this for a living. I mean, she's done TED Talks. She has written 5 best-selling books. And she's like, this shit is hard. So if Brené Brown finds this hard, can you imagine how difficult this was for our mum and our dad, right? And this is also not about blaming anyone, because that puts us in the victim role. That puts us very much in that adaptive child position, which we'll talk about in a second. So if Brené Brown struggles with this, it's no wonder our parents found it tough to articulate what they were going through. And as a result, we might have had instances as a kid where they just couldn't handle what was going on. And so it's that whole thing of like, go to your room, or I can't deal with this right now. And so what they would do was remove us from the environment just so that they could kind of be away from it. And that can look a lot of the times like abandonment when we're a kid. So if you're a kid and you're sat alone in your room and you're 5-6 years old and you don't really understand what's happened because your parents perhaps didn't have the language and the skill set to explain this, like, you know, in the perfect Brené Brown way, they didn't have that skill set because they weren't taught that. So you're 5 or 6 years old and you're like, well, what's going to happen next? Even if there's not a real threat to you, it's almost not important whether the threat was real or not. If it's a perceived threat and you felt scared as a kid and you felt abandoned and you felt neglected, whether or not you were is really beside the point. But the impact it had on you was, I'm 5 or 6 years old and the people who are entrusted with my care, they're not caring for me, and I feel overlooked and I don't feel seen and I feel afraid and I don't know when I'm going to be able to, you know, eat, and if I'm going to be safe, and if I'm going to be kicked out of the house because like my food and shelter is tied to these people. And so obviously not thinking that consciously as a kid, but that's what's going on. It's like, these are the people who keep me alive and I've been told to not be near them. And so there's this fear response of, I'm not going to survive. That's what it is. It's like a really foundational survival piece, right? So that's what's going on. So how is this related to love? It might seem like a tenuous link, but it's really strongly related, because when he's not texting back, okay, let's back it up a little bit. Let me explain the link. So with that, the first people you have a relationship with are your mother and your father. And I know this is a little bit Freudian and it might sound a bit incestuous or whatever, but they're the first human beings we form a bond with. So you can call that relationship or whatever, but it's that bond. So that really impacts how we bond with other people. You might have heard of attachment styles, which I won't go into today, and it's really not what I specialize in. But if you're not securely attached to the people who are entrusted with your care, your parents or your grandparents or your guardians, foster parents, whatever the situation was, if you're not securely attached, that impacts how you bond with other people. So if the first relationship you have is with your mum and dad, and then there's this like severance of that bond, and you don't really understand why, like they might have been, what's the word? disciplining you, but it might not have been communicated in that way, so you didn't really understand what was going on. In that situation, you're really afraid, and so the attachment is not secure with them. And so your attachment with the person that you care about now is not secure either, because it reminds you of that experience when you were a kid, right? So he's not texting back, and you have this bond, and your inner child is going, I'm going to be abandoned again. I'm afraid I'm going to be abandoned. I don't know what's going on. And that's where the anxiety is coming from. So knowing that, can you see why it doesn't matter what perfect line you text to him if your inner child is screaming, saying, help me, help me, help me. So the first step really is awareness. When you're in it and you're going, oh my God, he hasn't texted back, stop and ask yourself, what does this remind me of? How is this familiar to me? What happened to me that made me feel this way? So it might be, I was always shut away as a kid, or maybe I was neglected, or whatever the situation is for you, and it's difficult without knowing you personally, right? And then the second thing is to ask yourself, is this happening now? And it's not, right? Because we're adults now. And the next thing is to actually talk to that inner child. And this might, again, sound a bit out there and a bit woo, but it can be just as simple as you just saying internally to yourself, it's okay, you're all right, you're safe, I've got you, I'm your parent now, you're okay, you're safe, right? And you can do that out loud if you're able to, or if you're somewhere where you can't really say that out loud, you can just kind of just say it to yourself, just talk yourself through it. And that's really, I mean, there can be so many things, but that's a major one. When we're freaking out when someone hasn't responded, someone that we care about, it reminds us of that being shut away as a kid. It runs really, really deep. And this is why, you know, relationships are, for many of us, some of our deepest work. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Love Bites that was taken from a Facebook Live that I did a little bit earlier on today. It's Monday as I'm recording this. And as you can see, I like to go deep really, really quickly. And I just wanted to let you know that if you wanted to go even deeper with this work and get personal with it and get personal coaching from me one-to-one and in a group, I have a really beautiful program called Embodied and Empowered. And the whole focus of Embodied and Empowered is helping you gain power over your dating drama for good and no longer being consumed by these feelings of has he texted back, what's going on, and all this craziness that we have in our heads, and also becoming the confident feminine woman who turns heads. And the funny thing about that is when you become that woman, you're not bothered if people are looking at you or not. They do as a byproduct, but it's okay because you feel good within yourself, and so it really doesn't matter what anyone is doing or saying, because that's their choice, and that's all perfect and divine. So if this is really speaking to your heart and your soul, and this really feels like it could be your next step, then check out the details for Embodied and Empowered. They are below.